Welcome to Undefined. My name is Tim, and this podcast exists because of one Facebook post that turned into a much bigger conversation than I ever expected. I made a statement about dating and marriage that I thought people would either agree or disagree with pretty quickly. But instead, the comments opened up conversations about commitment, fear, trauma, covenant, modern dating culture, emotional ambiguity, divorce, vulnerability, and honestly, what love even means anymore. And the more conversations I had, the more I realized something. A lot of modern relationships feel undefined. Undefined expectations, undefined commitment, undefined direction, undefined purpose. And it seems like people are trying to navigate relationships while all working from completely different definitions of dating, love, exclusivity, commitment, and marriage. So, this podcast isn't really me trying to act like a relationship expert because I'm not one. I've never been married. I've rarely ever dated. And most of my thoughts come more from theology, philosophy, observation, conversations, and trying to understand modern culture more so than a personal relationship experience. This podcast exists because I have questions. Questions about commitment, questions about covenant, questions about vulnerability, questions about why modern relationships can feel emotionally exhausting even when connection is present. And I think a lot of people quietly have those same questions too. So, Undefined is simply a place to explore them out loud. Not to pretend we have all the answers, but to have deeper conversations than modern culture usually allows us to have. So, wherever you're coming from, I'm glad you're here. Let's get into it. One thing I keep noticing in the responses to this series is that most people are not actually arguing against commitment itself. Most people still want love, they still want stability, they still want permanence, and they still want partnership. They want someone to build a life with. What people seem to be afraid of is what happens when commitment goes wrong. And honestly, I think that changes the conversation completely because a lot of modern relationship conversations immediately assume hesitation means people are immature or scared of commitment. But the more comments I read, the more I think many people are carrying something deeper than that. Some people watched their parents' marriage fall apart. Some people trusted someone fully and got blindsided. Some people invested years into relationships that never became stable. Others are terrified of choosing wrong and having their entire future shaped by one painful decision. And whether we realize it or not, those experiences shape how people approach relationships. So I think there's a difference between someone rejecting commitment and someone struggling to trust permanence. Those are not the same thing because many people aren't trying to avoid love, they're trying to avoid pain. And honestly, I think modern relationships are being shaped by those fears more than we realize because now people are trying to balance two desires at the same time. The desire to feel emotionally safe and the desire to experience deep connection. And sometimes those desires pull against each other because love requires vulnerability, but vulnerability always carries risk. And maybe that's part of why modern dating feels so emotionally complicated. Not because people don't care about relationships anymore, but because people no longer know how to approach commitment without fear. There's one phrase that keeps showing up over and over in these conversations: trust takes time. And honestly, I agree with that. Trust should take time. You don't really know someone after a handful of good conversations. You don't fully know someone because chemistry feels strong. Character usually reveals itself slowly, especially once life becomes inconvenient. You learn a lot about people through consistency, conflict, disappointment, pressure, miscommunication, stress. Time has a way of exposing what excitement can temporarily hide. So I completely understand why people move carefully now, because discernment matters. Learning someone's character matters. I don't think wisdom means rushing emotionally into something serious before trust has actually been established. But I also think there's a difference between intentional discernment and slowly drifting into emotional detachment without direction. Because time alone does not automatically create clarity. Sometimes two people spend months or years becoming emotionally connected while avoiding honest conversations about where the relationship is actually going. And I think that's where things become difficult, because people can start functioning emotionally like a committed couple without ever establishing shared expectations. This means there's no real clarity, no real direction, and no real definition. Just emotional closeness mixed with uncertainty. And eventually, that ambiguity starts affecting people emotionally, whether they intended for it to or not. So I think the real question becomes, how do you build trust intentionally without creating relationships that remain emotionally undefined forever? I think modern relationships are often caught between two fears at the exact same time: the fear of committing too quickly and the fear of spending years emotionally invested in something that never becomes clear. I honestly think a lot of modern dating behavior makes more sense once you realize people are trying to avoid two completely different outcomes simultaneously. On one side, people are terrified of committing too quickly. They fear ignoring red flags, choosing the wrong person, getting trapped in unhealthy relationships, ending up divorced, losing themselves emotionally, building a future with someone they eventually realize they cannot trust. And those fears are honestly understandable. But on the other side, people are also terrified of wasting years inside relationships that never become stable. Relationships that feel emotionally serious but never fully defined, where people act emotionally committed without ever clearly deciding what they are building toward. And I think a lot of people are exhausted because they're trying to navigate both fears at the same time. They want closeness, but they also want protection. They want security, but they fear vulnerability. They want emotional connection while still protecting themselves from emotional devastation. So, relationships often end up existing in this strange middle space where people bond deeply while simultaneously trying to avoid full surrender. And honestly, I think that tension explains a lot about modern dating culture, because people are trying to experience intimacy without risking heartbreak. But the problem is, emotional attachment naturally creates emotional weight, whether we define the relationship or not. And eventually, people start feeling the tension between emotional closeness and emotional uncertainty. That's why modern relationships can feel so exhausting sometimes. People are trying to avoid pain while also trying to experience connection. The more I think about this, the more I wonder if modern relationships are trying to create something that's almost impossible: commitment without vulnerability. People increasingly want guarantees before surrender, proof before trust, certainty before commitment. And honestly, that desire makes sense. Nobody wants unnecessary pain. Nobody wants betrayal. Nobody wants to build their life around someone unsafe. But at the same time, love has never really come with guarantees. Commitment has always involved uncertainty. Not recklessness, it's not blindness, vulnerability. At some point, every meaningful relationship requires trust beyond complete certainty. And I think modern dating culture sometimes struggles with that reality because we now have endless ways to delay vulnerability. We have undefined relationships, low expectations, keeping our options open, avoiding labels, avoiding difficult conversations, staying emotionally close while emotionally non-committal. And sometimes those strategies are attempts to protect ourselves, but ironically, they can also create the exact anxiety we were trying to avoid. Because ambiguity may reduce immediate pressure, but it often increases long-term uncertainty. And humans naturally crave stability. We crave clarity, reassurance, direction. So eventually, people start asking questions internally, even if they never say them out loud. What are we actually doing? Where is this going? Are we building toward the same future? Do we both view this relationship the same way? And the longer those questions remain unanswered, the heavier the ambiguity can become. So I think one of the hardest parts of modern relationships is this: at what point does protecting yourself from heartbreak start preventing you from fully building trust at all? I want to make something very clear. I do not think taking relationships seriously means rushing them. And I do not think intentional discernment is unhealthy. In fact, I think discernment is wise. Learning someone's character matters. Paying attention matters. Asking the difficult questions matters. Understanding values, priorities, emotional maturity, and long-term direction matters. That's not fear, that's responsibility. But I also think there's a difference between discernment and drifting, because drifting often avoids clarity altogether. It avoids defining the relationship. It avoids the difficult conversations. It avoids discussing expectations. It avoids asking where things are going. This isn't always because people are being manipulative. Sometimes people drift because they're scared. They could be scared of pressure, scared of losing the relationship, scared of rejection, scared of hearing an answer that they may not like. So instead, they just stay emotionally connected while postponing clarity indefinitely. And I think people can accidentally build emotionally serious relationships while avoiding emotionally serious conversations. And I think that happens more than we realize. Two people slowly build routines together. They build dependence together. They build attachment towards one another. Meanwhile, they may still have completely different visions of the future. And eventually, the emotional weight becomes difficult to ignore, because emotional intimacy naturally creates expectations, even when nobody says them out loud. I think a lot of people are emotionally exhausted right now. not because they don't care about their relationships, but because they don't know what many of their relationships actually are. And ambiguity affects people more deeply than we sometimes admit. Because when expectations are unclear, people start overanalyzing everything. Small changes in communication feel huge. Uncertainty creates anxiety. People hesitate to ask important questions because they fear ruining the connection. And eventually, relationships can start feeling emotionally unstable, even when the feelings themselves are real. Emotional closeness and emotional clarity are not automatically the same thing. I think one of the biggest lessons emerging from these conversations is that people often define relationships very different. Two people can be emotionally invested in the same relationship while imagining completely different futures. And if those expectations are never honestly discussed, confusion eventually becomes inevitable. And that's why clarity matters. Not because labeling something magically fixes it, but because mutual understanding matters. Shared direction matters. Knowing whether we're working intentionally toward the same future matters. And maybe that's part of why so many modern relationships feel emotionally heavy. Because emotional closeness without clarity eventually becomes difficult to carry. So, the more conversations I've had around this topic, the less I think modern people are avoiding love itself. I think many people are trying to figure out how to trust again. And honestly, I get it. Discernment matters. Wisdom matters. Learning someone's character matters. But I also think ambiguity affects people more deeply than we sometimes acknowledge. Because emotional attachment naturally creates emotional expectations, even when nobody says them out loud. And maybe modern relationships are struggling because people are trying to hold two very human desires at the same time: the desire to feel safe and the desire to be fully known and fully loved. And maybe that's the real tension underneath all of this. Not simply whether people should commit, but how people learn to build trust intentionally without remaining emotionally undefined forever.